Thank you very much, Giulia and Trinka, for your kind invitation to participate in the roundtable. It has been a great pleasure for me to follow the public lectures as well, and I'm looking very much forward to our discussions and further collaboration. As indicated in my abstract, I will just share my screen just so to put the text under your eyes because of my accent. It might be easier to follow can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. And can you see that I added this wonderful adjective early that Trinka just suggested? I was, of course, we in comparative literature, and this point we'll discuss today, ancient and modern. And I told it ancient and modern because I thought, how could I put medieval, Renaissance, and all this? And this early is just fantastic. Thank you very much, Trinka. I will not deal with medieval literature, nevertheless, but it is just to say that it is really part of the chronology and of the necessity to put all our reflection and comparison as well into historical context, as we have seen until now. Trinka told us, and Emmanuel as well, and I will go into the same direction. I take up some of the topics I discussed in a more expansive way in the public lecture, so I just compressed it to make it 15 minutes, and now I go. Differentiation denotes the process that relates to the similar to the different instead of opposing them. Without differentiation and relation of some kind, comparison is not possible, confirms Earl Minor. We cannot compare that which is the same. Some difference must exist, or else we identify rather than compare. This is an important epistemological reminder because the focalization on the same and on pre-constructed universals is still more common in comparative literature, in comparative studies, than the attention paid to difference and, most of all, differentiation. The evolution of languages, literatures, and cultures itself seem to be underlain by such a complex process of differentiation, which results, as I will argue, from the ongoing interaction and dialogism between different languages and cultures in given spaces and periods. I think we had the good demonstration with Trinka's expose of this ongoing dialogue and interaction. The tendency to generalize, essentialize, or universalize poetical or other discursive and cultural practices has been dominant since this 19th century and maybe before. Many scholars have pretended to define the tragedy, the tale, and the myth, presupposing that they were universal categories. Precise, differential, and dialogical comparative analysis of these cultural practices in various languages and cultures and periods clearly refutes this assumption and shows their meaningful differentiation from one period, one language and culture, and from one discursive and cultural community to another. The tendency to universalize cultural practices bears the danger of producing stereotypes and commonplace observations which prevent us from exploring their complex functioning in different periods, languages, and cultures. Differential comparative analysis focuses on the complex ways poetical and other discursive and cultural practices function. Comparison proves more efficient as a heuristic method when applied to dynamic functions rather than to static features and pre-constructed categories. Differential comparison is a fundamentally functionalist approach based on the discursive conception of languages and cultures grounded on the observation of the fundamentally dialogical and responsive orientation of discourse. The concept of dialogism makes us realize with Mikhail Bakhtin that, quote, in addition to its own theme, every utterance, text, and discourse always responds in the broad sense of the word in one form or another to others' utterances that preceded. Tsvetan Todorov insists on the importance of this insight in the following terms. The individual voice, I would say even the collective voice, can only make itself heard by integrating into the complex chorus of the already present voices. This is true not only of literature, but of any discourse, and Bakhtin is brought to suggest a new interpretation of culture. Culture is composed of discourses retained by the collective memory, commonplaces and stereotypes, as well as exceptional sayings, discourses that every speaker must respond to. Intertextual dialogism underlies all utterances, but we know that poetical discourse makes a particularly complex use of it. We can broaden the concept of intertextual dialogism to include the notion of interdiscursività, proposed by Cesare Segre, and speak of intertextual and interdiscursive dialogism. This insight in the fundamental dialogical and responsive orientation of cultural practices has been very helpful for my research on various poetical and cultural practices commonly universalized and, I would say, in need of differentiation. One of them is the discursive practice that consists in rewriting and reconfiguring the ancient narratives, ta archaea, commonly called the Greek and Roman myths. The presumption of a mythical substance or a universal meaning supposed inherent to these ancient narratives prevents us from realizing that this practice owes its enormous impact on European and non-European literatures and cultures to the extraordinary intertextual, interdiscursive, and intergeneric responsiveness. Sophocles and Euripides' tragedies respond to Aeschylus' tragedies. You all know better. Virgil's and Ovid's work respond to Greek literature, thus establishing a fundamental intertextual, interdiscursive, and intercultural dialogism passed on to Italian, Spanish, and other European, and by now to all the cultures of the world. All rewritings and reconfigurations of Greek and Roman myths, ancient, early, and modern, up to their latest representations in the digital media, are inscribed in this complex palimpsest and the complex chorus of all these voices already present. We can use both metaphors. The concept of intertextual and interdiscursive dialogism of responsiveness also allows us to reconsider the notions of filiation and source. Many scholars examine ancient texts exclusively in their role of sources, and not as discoursing, soliciting intertextual response. They mainly look for pre-constructed, universalized archetypes or motives, first in the ancient and then in the modern representations, in order to prove their universal character. However, a mythological motive or theme is never taken over as such in subsequent rewritings and reconfigurations of a particular myth, nor is it developed in the same sense the ancient texts gave to it. The early and modern rewritings change, invert, or condense the motifs and plot fragments taken from the ancient text and inscribe it in new discursive contexts, thus attributing differential and new meanings to the ancient narratives. I have proposed to ground dialogical and differential comparatism on a set of epistemological and methodological requirements, such as the necessity to avoid pre-constructed universals by consciously constructing the comparable, construire les comparables in Détienne's words. The requirement to elaborate precise criteria for analysis and comparison rather than relying on pre-constructed criteria results from the epistemological insight that all our theories, notions, and units of analysis are object constructions. The definition of any generic label or concept to define particular cultural practices in different periods and spaces are object constructions that need to be re-examined and clarified before used as criteria for analysis and comparison. This methodological requirement is even more important when dealing with text and discourses produced in different languages and cultures. As comparatists know well, concepts and notions do not necessarily denote the same phenomena in different languages, periods, and cultures, as shown in Barbara Cassin's Dictionary of Intranslatables. Moreover, the criteria chosen for differential and dialogical comparatism should be of equal relevance for all the languages, literatures, and cultures, ancient, early, and modern, to be compared. We need to construct the comparables, in French you can use the plural, in a way that avoids giving preference to certain cultures or languages, ancient and modern. That is what Giulia explained before. This means we need criteria that do not introduce preconceived judgments about the value of the text and discourses to be compared, nor favor one of the languages or culture they come from. Indeed, if we do not grant the same importance to all the objects of study to be compared, we risk introducing and imposing preconceived values and judgments. This means that we have to deconstruct certain hierarchies imposed by the distinction of high or primitive culture, of major or minor languages, major and minor texts, and kinds of discourse, major and minor genres, and so forth. This option has important consequences for the constitution of the corpora to be analyzed and compared. It is the reason why we should also include non-canonized cultural creations in our research, in order to avoid reintroducing established dogmata alongside with commonplace nationalistic, sexist, and other kind of prejudice we want precisely to get rid of by way of differential and dialogical comparison. Instead of thinking the world in terms of universality and universalization, the Caribbean author Patrick Chamoiseau invites us to consider the world in terms of diversality. From the often flattening universality, we tend towards an imagination where the human community expresses itself through diversity. And this dynamics of the unity, which constitute itself in the diverse, is called diversality. The neologism diversality, as opposed to the often flattening universality, introduces a new paradigm. Rethinking the world and history in terms of diversality instead of universality requires the recognition of diversity as a fundamental feature and dynamics of humanity, and no longer as an exception of its pretended universality. I suggest to ground differential and dialogical comparison on the fundamental recognition of diversality in replacement of universality, and replace the option of universalization with the one of diversalization. The Caribbean authors have associated universalizing and colonizing by opposing the neologism diversality to the pretension of universality and universalization. The recognition of diversality and diversalization as fundamental dynamics allows us to deconstruct pre-constructed universals in all fields of research, including the studies of classics, and thus decolonize the classics. Differential, dialogical, and diversalizing comparison gives new insight into the creative process at work in the intense and still ongoing dialogue between ancient, early, and modern languages, literatures, and cultures. As such, differential and dialogical comparison might help us, as Giulia and Trinka suggest, to reorient our research and refresh our language in a non-ethnocentric, non-linear, non-idealizing, non-neoclassic perspective. Thank you for your attention.